Now, in this video, which has been sponsored very kindly by Audible, more of that later, I'm going to try to get to the bottom of the incredibly complicated thing that is the history of Yugoslavia during World War II. Now, I will have to, as I always do, paint with very broad brushstrokes. Now, if you are watching this video because a friend of yours has seen it and said, oh, this is really good, there's a video about Yugoslavia in World War II on the Lindy-based channel, you should see it, and perhaps he's sitting with you watching it saying, it's good, isn't it? It's good, isn't it? You can, if you want to come across as knowledgeable, discerning, intelligent, and perhaps with a healthy degree of skepticism, hit the pause button, it's usually the space bar, at some point in the middle of this video, turn to your friend and say, actually it was more complicated than that. Because you will almost certainly be right. And this is a very handy phrase to have in your quiver. If you want to come across as all those good things, then you will almost always be right if you say that about something that someone is discussing in history, a big theme of history, politics, war and so forth, all the big stuff. It's always more complicated than that. So have you got the phrase? Actually, it was more complicated than that. You've got it. Okay. Have that standing by. Now, I was fascinated by the history of Yugoslavia in World War II, but I never really felt that I understood it. It was so very complicated and vague. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to have to read a couple of books about it. So I got a couple of books and I read them. And at the end of that, I really had no idea what the hell was going on in Yugoslavia. It was all just so complicated and vague and alien until I read this book, Eastern Approaches by Fitzroy Maclean. And at the end of this, I thought, okay, I think now I've got a reasonable grasp, perhaps good enough to try passing it on to other people. But do bear in mind that phrase. Now, he had a very interesting war, and I've mentioned him in one of my earlier videos because he was one of the first members of the SAS, and he had lots of adventures in North Africa and was making his way towards Persia. Persia, of course, being quite strategic because of its oil reserves. And Rommel's plan, had he defeated the Eighth Army, was to go over to Persia and capture the American and British pipeline that took fuel to the Soviet Union. So you can imagine there was high stakes. And anyway, he was having fun bashing his way around the Middle East involved with that, when suddenly he got a telegram out of the blue summoning him to Britain and summoning him now. He left that very day by plane thinking, blimey, wonder what this is all about. And he was summoned to Chequers, which is the countryside retreat of the British Prime Minister. And there was Winston Churchill and his staff watching a lot of films. All sorts of films, propaganda films, training films, information films, entertainment films. And it was during a screening of a Donald Duck film that a message arrived. In came the messenger, put the note into the hand of the PM. The PM looked at it gravely and signalled for the projectionist to stop, stood up and said, "Gentlemen, I have news here that Mussolini has just stepped down. And now, back to that duck." So that was the stage we were at in the war. It was 1943 and the Italians were already crumbling. And what Winston wanted to know was which was the side to back in the struggle against the foe in Yugoslavia. It wasn't obvious. Now, Fitzgerald and many others had heard of the famous General Mihailovic, who was the leader of the Chetniks. And the Chetniks were big beard-wearing, fierce fighters who were resisting the Axis forces in Yugoslavia. And he was being hailed as quite a hero. He was quite famous. But there were others, it seems, involved in the struggle, including some shadowy figure called Tito. Was that actually his name? They got the big boys bumper book of Serbo-Croat names and they couldn't find Tito in there. I find this fascinating that at this stage the British knew so little about Tito. They just didn't know who he was or even what he was. It was thought, for instance, that Tito could have been an acronym standing for this, you see, and that is Secret International Terrorist Organization. Okay, secret's a bit difficult, but the rest you guessed, right? And that seemed perfectly reasonable. Maybe Tito wasn't actually a person, but it was like a rank. Whoever was leader at that point for that operation was called Tito, a bit like in the British Army, Sunray is your local commander. Well, maybe there were loads of Titos, or a committee of Titos, and it was, yeah, some sort of title, some sort of rank, some sort of code name. I was talking to a Croat recently, and she said that as far as she knew, it was an alias of his to go by the name of Titus, and this got shortened to Tito as a sort of nickname version of Titus, and he quite liked it. And a lot of interwar communist agitators had these aliases that they went by, and so he quite liked that. Another possible derivation of Tito is that the phrase "you will do this," which comes out like this, notice it's got a T and a toe in it. Well, that's you this. So you can imagine someone coming in the room and saying, you this, you that. You this can be used to mean you will do this. So maybe Tito stuck because for some reason that was appropriate to him. You this. But anyway, there was another rumour, by the way, that Tito was actually a beautiful woman, a dashing bandit in the hills who had thrown together a load of desperados and brigands, and with her amazing charisma was leading them. But that was just romantic nonsense. But anyway, the mission that Maclean was being given was to go to Yugoslavia. He would be parachuted in, meet this Tito entity, and then assess and find out that these partisans, should we be backing those? Or maybe Mihailovic and his Chetniks are the people to back, or maybe there's someone else. There were so many different resistant groups they'd heard of, but who's actually fighting the Bosch most effectively? And Maclean said to Churchill, but whoever this Tito is, he's probably a communist. And Churchill was very straightforward with him. He said, look, the war's not going brilliantly. It's just turning in our favour now. We're probably going to win, but there's still a hell of a lot of fighting to do from this point onwards. And it's going to be extremely difficult as we get closer to the fatherland. The Germans might fight harder and harder and harder. And so the fewer Germans there are there protecting that fatherland, the better. And the easier a time we're going to have of it. It's going to be worth our while just backing whoever is fighting the Germans most effectively. If they're communists, so be it. Our single priority is to get this war won with the minimum loss of life. And if we can do that, hooray, even if we have ended up backing a communist. And Maclean, though he was no fan of communism himself, in fact, he went on to become a Conservative MP. In fact, he'd already been a Conservative MP for a very short while, but he handed his seat over to a mate of his. Yeah, you could do it in those days. That was just to get out of the diplomatic corps. Though he's no sympathiser with the communists, he thought, yeah, that probably is the wise and sensible course of action. Whoever's fighting the Bosch, we'll back them. Okay, I'll parachute in and try to find out who this Tito is. But you do understand that I don't actually speak Serbo-Croat, but I do speak Russian fluently, and so that'll make life easier for me. But I don't know anything about Yugoslavia, really. So he had to read up on Yugoslavia, and he got a load of books and read up. So here I'm going to try to summarise. Oh, I haven't told you, sorry, I haven't told you who Tito actually was. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. No, I'll do it now. Tito was actually a soldier in World War I who was fighting against the Russians and got captured, made a prisoner of war. But then, do you know what? The October Revolution happened in 1917 and the Russians became communists. And he, being a captive, I think the communists are great. And they looked at him and thought, he's our man. Let that chap free, and all those like him. And so those who were happy to join the Reds were set free, and he became quite a committed Red. And he was a bit of a political agitator in that direction in the interwar period. And that's as much detail as I'm going to give you at this point. Oh, apart from his real name, which was Josip Broz. But I'm going to call him Tito from now on. Now, okay, summary of super broad brushstrokes. Okay, there were the Dark Ages, and these are also known as the Migration Period because an awful lot of people went zipping around Europe in all sorts of directions and generally confusing the heck out of historians and archaeologists for many centuries to come. And a load of Slavs wound up in that land that would be known as the land of the South Slavs. Yugo means south. Yugoslavia, land of the South Slavs. But these were not one unified people, one nation as we would recognise it today. There were a load of petty tribes with their little chieftains, and they were all warring with each other for dominance. But none of these chieftains was powerful to really assert himself over the whole of Yugoslavia. So he would think to himself, I know what I can do is I can get the backing of some powerful regional power like the Venetians, for instance, and then I'll be able to beat my rivals, and then, ha-ha, it'll be great. And so they would do this, and then it would be great, and then after a while they would start to resent the fact that there's all this foreign domination, a lot of interference. We wanted to, independence from these dratted Venetians, so how can we get rid of it? I know, we can ally a load of the local chieftains to throw off the yoke of this external power. So hey, and they do that, and then they realize, oh no, wait a minute, this is the situation we were in before with all the petty rivalry. How can we get, I know, we'll ally a different foreign power, and yeah, repeat. This happens many times. So you have local powers around Yugoslavia all pulling the strings, backing one side against another, and no one ever really achieving unity and stable dominance. So you have the Venetians in the west, you have the Austrians and Hungarians in the north, and from 1389 onwards the Turks arrive and they conquer the south and east. And that's very roughly the situation for about 3 centuries. So how long is 3 centuries? Well, if you imagine today a generation's about 33 1/3 years, so 3 per century. But back in those days, people had children younger. Maybe it was 4 generations per century. So 3 centuries are 12 generations. That's a long time. Just think how different your generation is from your parents' generation, and how different your generation is from your grandparents' generation in terms of culture and attitudes and the like. So if you were living in an area dominated by the Turks, after many generations, it's only natural to imagine that some of you, what with intermarriage and all the rest of it, are going to end up being Muslims, aren't you? As a lot of the Bosnians did. And you've got different religions in these different regions, and you've got different ethnic groupings in these regions, and after a while they become separate, and they've been separate for so long that the linguistics starts to diverge as well, and so they become quite distinct from those dominated by a different foreign power just across the border. Exactly which the foreign power was changes over time. The Venetians, of course, wane, and for a while you've got it's Austro-Hungary and Turkey and Russia are the 3 main powers pulling the strings in the region. But it's the same sort of idea. You've got these people influenced by other cultures growing slowly apart. The Serbs in the east end up being Orthodox Christians, but influenced by the Austrians and to some degree the Italians. In the west you've got Roman Catholics as well as Muslims in the southeast. So you've got political, ethnic, linguistic, to some degree racial and religious differences between these people over many generations. So that's something that's very difficult to very quickly reconcile. Now in the 19th century the Ottoman Empire starts to crumble, and this feeling of sort of pan-Slavic unity and brotherhood as well as independence and freedom starts to take shape. Now you may say, hang on, sorry, unity and brotherhood or independence and freedom, those are incompatible ideas. Well, what the hell, throw them all into the mix. Yes, they're incompatible ideas, but unity and brotherhood and independence and freedom from everyone, and yeah, it'll be great. Pan-Slavic movement, this feeling that there is a natural unit that is Yugoslavia. Somehow it could get it together and become a power or a notable player on the world stage, perhaps. Who knows? But the nation was still divided. If you were to go to Zagreb, you would find quite a European-looking city, but Belgrade, on the other hand, looked more like a Turkish fortress. Now, from the next century or two, you get an awful lot of struggle between just a few families, looking at the various kings and princes and regents and prime ministers and rulers of various kinds. Very few surnames, only 2 or 3 surnames cropping up again and again. Some guy would become king, then he would get ousted, and then his son would become king, who would get ousted, but then his brother would become king, and ditto the prime ministers, and it doesn't matter which side was backing who and who'd pushed that. Someone was always related to one of these two or three families. So there are just a couple of big dynasties battling it out. And right, let's fast forward to 1921 and a chap called King Alexander. Well, a chap called Alexander becomes king. He's sometimes rather superfluously described as King Alexander the First, but there wasn't a second, so why call him the first? And he was rather pro-Serb, rather stern, and he wasn't really a great king in that he didn't unify the nation. He didn't act as that figurehead to make everyone think, yes, he's our king, because he was a little bit too pro-Serb. That really annoyed people like the Croats. And in 1928, he set himself up effectively as a dictator, as like an absolute monarch, and he ruled, well, iron fist is possibly an exaggeration, but he definitely, it was an authoritarian centralist regime based on him as an individual person, and because he was rather pro-Serb, he became the enemy of the Ustasha. Now the Ustasha, they were Croats, and they were very definitely anti the king and anti the Serb dominance of the region, and they were a bit, you might call, keen. Now the Ustasha were later backed by Mussolini, so a lot of people refer to them slightly inaccurately as fascists, but it does seem that they did lean that way a bit. And when the Germans later occupied Yugoslavia, it did seem that they favoured fighting on the German side quite a lot. And a lot of the local rulers that were set up by the occupying Axis forces, they had their own units of Ustasha. Maclean, he describes them as an equivalent to the SS. I've also read them described as a sort of Praetorian Guard. You get the general idea, okay? They were that way inclined. So they were very, very keen, politically motivated, you might say to some degree, terror troops, or even sort of Gestapo-like police. But anyway, you get the idea, the Ustasha. And they were really against the king and thought, right, well, we'll kill him. The thing is that the king was very well protected, but then he made them a classic error. Because you know what they say, never go to France. He went to France, and whilst he was there, they killed him. They assassinated the king, and his son was only 11 years old at the time, deemed too young by the laws of the land and by the will also of the king to become king himself. And so according to the will, instead, Prince Paul would become regent, and this he did. Now, Prince Paul, it seems, was a well-meaning guy. He was very definitely a strong Anglophile. He'd gone to school in Britain, and he tried to reform matters. He moderated the rule quite a bit, wasn't nearly so authoritarian, involved Parliament in decision-making far more, made various concessions to the Croats, and was doing his best. But it seems that maybe he was a little bit weak, as exemplified by the fact that when the Axis powers issued an ultimatum to him and to his parliament, saying you must sign up to the Tripartite Pact, that is the Tripartite Pact of Germany, Japan and Italy, the main Axis powers, join us, like Hungary and Bulgaria did, he caved in, and so did his parliament, caved in, and they signed the pact. Much to the fury of the British. Winston Churchill never forgave him. He was hoping to go into exile, like so many other exiled European royalty, to Britain, but no, he spent the war in Kenya, British-controlled Kenya instead. He managed to get a couple of his members of his family back to Britain, but nope, we're not having you, said Churchill, because you are a traitor. You joined the enemy. You signed over your country to the enemy, and I'm sorry, but I can't at least be seen to forgive you. What was this? War? Invasion? Hang on, didn't we just sign up to a deal so that this presumably wouldn't happen? Well, it did happen. The Axis forces of Hungary and Bulgaria and Italy and Germany all simultaneously invaded Yugoslavia just 10 days after the Tripartite Act had been signed. And they invaded with such overwhelming forces that the Yugoslav army stood not a hope. And 11 days later, it was all over. The whole of Yugoslavia was under the jackboot, so to speak. But it didn't completely end there. You see, a lot of people were not happy with this signing of the Tripartite Pact, and they had decided to not recognise Paul as regent anymore, but instead to set up the young king, who was 17, so he was actually not technically old enough to be king here, but what's a year here or there? He can be king. They went round to his palace. It was a coup. Essentially, it was a military coup, you could say. It was led by a load of army generals who wanted to carry on the fight with the enemy, and he seemed a brave lad. He opened a window, shinned down a drain pipe, joined the crowds, got into a car, drove it himself through the thronging crowds, waving at everyone, saying, "Okay, right, yes, I'm throwing my weight behind these rebel." Rebel generals, these Chetniks, and yes, we can make a fight of it, and I represent you now. I'm your king. Hooray! Some people say.
Actually, it was more complicated than that.
And so he had, if you like, chosen a side. He had chosen the Western Allied side, and that, of course, wasn't going to please the Germans, which meant that come the conquest of Yugoslavia, he had to hightail it out of there, and he went to London. And there he joined the RAF. Here's a picture of him, aged 18. Notice he's in RAF uniform. He became an officer. I imagine it's easier to be selected for officer training if you've already been king. And he made lots of broadcasts throughout the war from London, exhorting his people to carry on the fight and to support the Western Allies, to do as much harm as they could to the Germans and the occupying forces, and of course to help the Chetniks under the command of Mihailovic. When he left, he didn't take all of his cabinet with him. He'd put together a reasonably mixed cabinet that represented all the various factions within Yugoslavia reasonably well, but by the time he got to London, he had a much smaller cabinet. Not all of them came with him, and there was a very definite Serbian bias to this, which was perhaps in the long term rather unfortunate. For pretty much all concerned, really. At this point in the war, the Axis forces are still allied to Russia, and the official Russian line is that this war was the second imperialist war being fought by the nasty imperialist British. Yeah, I know, it's amazing, isn't it, in retrospect? But yep, that's what they were saying at the time. Pretty soon after that, Barbarossa happened, and do you know what? They changed their tune. Funny that. Anyway, Barbarossa, just in case you didn't know, was the German invasion of Russia. Now, the resistance would liberate an area, sometimes quite large areas, from the domination of the occupying forces, but then they couldn't hold on to that area. They were untrained militias armed with small arms. They had no artillery, no tanks, no planes, nothing like that. They were armed just with what small arms they could scrape together, and they were up against 10, later 12 German divisions of well-trained, well-equipped, well-coordinated, competently commanded troops. And so they could never hold an area. You might ambush a German patrol somewhere and kill them all, ha-ha! But then the Germans would come back in force, and whatever area you'd taken, a hill, a forest, whatever, a town, they would throw you out of it pretty quickly. So they could make a gain, but then they would just lose it straight away. They weren't really achieving anything much. And they sat down and did the maths and decided, well, considering how many people we've got, how many people they've got, what our resources are, their resources, how long we can keep this going for, we need to kill 5 of them for every man that we lose in order to score a victory. So we're really pretty up against it here. And the Germans, following Hitler's instructions, adopted a policy of very savage retributions. For a lot of the war, if one German soldier was killed, they would retaliate by killing 100 Yugoslav civilians, perhaps completely innocent civilians. For every German soldier wounded, 50. So you can see that that's a pretty effective, though very, very brutal, way of suppressing a rebellion. And Mihailovic started to think, it's just not worth it. We kill some of them, they kill loads of us. There's not a lot I can do to stop the retributions happening. I'm doing my country more harm than good by fighting this fight. So he shrank from the necessary level of brutality to carry on the fight. Tito, on the other hand, didn't seem to have such qualms, partly because he was more mobile. He was hitting there, he would hit in some area and then disappear from that area, and the retaliation, the retribution would be carried out when he wasn't there to see it and when his supporters weren't there to see it, on some other people somewhere else. Meanwhile, he was building up his personal following and training up his army and gaining more support. So he was more willing to be that ruthless. How many men did Tito have? This is a difficult one to answer. I have looked at many sources and they differ radically. Maclean in his book reckons that he had something like 250,000. I noticed that accords very roughly with several different figures in various Wikipedia articles that vary between about 215,000 to 260,000, something like that. But other British agents who were in the field at the time assessing numbers, they reckoned that maybe he had as few as 60,000, which was a similar number to Mihailovic. He didn't actually outnumber the Chetniks as he wanted Maclean to believe. So was he making himself look stronger in order to gain British support? Well, he would have a very strong motivating factor there, wouldn't he? And Maclean would never be able to see 260,000 partisans all at once. And since he was spending a lot of his time in Yugoslavia going around with Tito, Tito knew where his partisans were. So everywhere Tito went with Maclean in tow, he would see lots of partisans. And yet other British agents elsewhere operating in Yugoslavia, they say they could travel around a hell of a big area and not encounter a single partisan. They weren't getting the impression that partisans were nearly so common. Anyway, in short then, I don't know. And I don't think anybody else knows either. And if we've got to this stage in history without anyone finding out, we probably never will know how many men Tito actually had in 1943 when Maclean showed up. Now, over the 3 years of fighting, there were about 7 main German offences, all of which petered out after a while. Or I should say that at this point, the Russians are doing next to nothing at this point. So Tito is one of many resistance movements. Many of them are communist, and it's very difficult to sort out the relationships between all these various communist resistance groups. Are they fighting each other? Are they ignoring each other? Are they collaborating? It's very, very difficult to disentangle the mess, but there do seem to be 2 main groups, the Chetniks and the partisans. There's not just ethnic and geographical and linguistic and political and religious divides. There are also divides amongst personal loyalty to individual leaders. And a lot of people who were acting in command of some unit of the Chetniks, for instance, were not acting on the orders of the overall commander, Mihailovic. They were perhaps going off on their own. So if some Chetniks were, for example, doing nothing or collaborating with the partisans or one of the many Axis powers, then they might not have been doing that with the overall commander's blessing. So it's very difficult to disentangle. If some Chetniks do something, does that mean that the Chetniks in general, are doing that? There were several groups of Chetniks and they had quite divided loyalties. So that's another level of complexity you have to throw into the mix. The local puppet rulers, as I said, had these Ustasha little sort of mini SS forces to call on. They also had some naval forces and air force, but the air force was really commanded in effect by the Germans. They were given an air force to play with, but only as long as the Germans cleared everything and supplied an awful lot of the equipment. So really they weren't so independent, these local puppet rulers. And what they could do independently of the Axis powers was extremely limited as well. But of course they were all trying to settle scores as well. So that's another level of complexity you have to add into the mix, which I won't claim to fully understand, but also I'm pretty confident no one fully understands because it is just too complicated. So what do the British do? They have to pick a side and back it if it's to be effective. So should they back Tito or should they back the Chetniks? They decided to give the Chetniks an ultimatum. It seemed to Maclean, through the lens of his dealings with Tito, that the Chetniks weren't fighting the Germans very much and possibly even collaborating with them. He later describes how they had liaison officers for liaising with the Axis forces, and the Axis forces were accidentally on purpose leaving lots of supplies where they could be found, or other times just straightforwardly supplying them. So it looked as though the loyalty of the Chetniks perhaps was suspect, and the effectiveness of the partisans was more of a sure bet. An ultimatum was issued to Mihailovic. There was a big railway bridge, and the British said, right, okay, this date is your deadline. If you destroy that railway bridge by this date, then maybe you can have our backing. Otherwise, we're going to go over and put our full backing to Tito, and you will have lost our support. So it's up to you. You have a deadline, you have a target, go to it. So what did Mihailovic do? Well, I think in order to foster some sort of sense of suspense, I'm going to leave it there for a section whilst I get on to talk to you about my sponsor. And before you rush off and go, oh no, I'm going to fast forward because this is just the advert bit, he's going to try to sell me something. Can I just say that there is actually quite a useful offer that you might want to take advantage of, which is completely free. You won't have to download anything, sign up for anything, give out any credit card details or take out any subscriptions or anything like that. You can just use it for free, and it's called stories.audible.com. It's a separate website from the main Audible website, and it's been set up during this time of quarantine to help people who have got kids in the house all the time and are perhaps finding it a little bit difficult to entertain them, distract them, keep them occupied, things to share with them as well. So they've set up this website, stories.audible.com, and on that are lots of things that have been selected as suitable for family and children listening, educational, entertainment, that sort of stuff. So you may want to just avail yourself of some of that free stuff that's there, no obligation at all. Also, you may have found that you've been finding it difficult to sleep lately. Actually, I have a bit. And there are also now some free Audible material available for those Audible files to help you sleep of various sorts. So you might want to check those out. Anyway, the mainstream Audible website is known particularly for its audiobooks, but it's not just audiobooks. They have periodicals, they have podcasts and comedy shows and other stuff too, including Audible Originals. Now, an Audible Original is something that Audible has commissioned, and it exists only on the Audible site. And here's the big thing that's different now. Whereas in the past, there were other things that you might want to choose, or then later on it was you get 2 free per month as a member. Now it's any number, it's unlimited. You can listen to any number of Audible Originals if you sign up for the service. So why not go to www.audible.com/LindyBeige or text LindyBeige to 500 500, and then you can go to their site via those particular coded messages with the LindyBeige, and you see it's a way of supporting my channel. If you go to them via me, they will know that you got to them via me, and so then they will be more likely to sponsor me in the future. So that's, you know, that would be quite nice. So if you were to type in, as I did, partisans, that's me typing in partisans, then one of the first hits you will get is a book upon which the film Defiance, starring Daniel Craig, you know, he played James Bond, that gave it quite a bit of prominence, it was based. And it's about the Bielski partisans. These were partisans who hid out in the forests of what was at the time eastern Poland, but is now western Belarus. The whole of Poland sort of shifted to the left a bit, in more ways than one, at the end of World War II. So you might be interested in the story behind that, and there is an audiobook of it, as I'm illustrating on the screen, probably here. I don't know, I haven't done the editing yet. So why not go to www.audible.com/LindyBeige or text LindyBeige to 500 500 to find out more about all that sort of stuff. Okay, right, now, the bridge. There was a railway bridge, and if you remember, there was a deadline, and he missed the deadline. He did not blow up the bridge, and so the British thought, right, okay, that's it then. We're going to throw a lot behind this shadowy, weird Tito guy that we don't particularly know or trust. But we've got to back someone, and it's going to be him. This was a decision that Churchill later regretted. Tito's a lot of partisans out on the hill. By the way, the partisans, they salute differently. They don't do this or this. Their salute was with a fist, smash the system, brother, like that against the temple. I don't think it was completely unique to them. I've seen people saluting like that, communists fighting in the Spanish Civil War. So it's very similar to, oh no, sorry, it was that knuckle. So it's very similar to, but not quite the same as the salute of the PFJ. That's the PFJ, the People's Front of Judea, not the Popular Front of Judea, splitters. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that in as a little tidbit of knowledge. And for no particular reason, I've just been reminded of a horrible anecdote that Maclean tells in his book, of a dance at which a load of partisans were dancing, and the partisan women like to wear grenades on their belts. It's a bit of a fashion thing. I suppose it's their way of saying that they've thrown their lot in with the partisans, and they won't take me alive. I've got a grenade. I'm a partisan to the end. Well, she was dancing with some red devils on her belt. Now, if you're not familiar with the Red Devil was a grenade. It was an Italian grenade. They were actually physically painted red, so that's one reason they were called that, but they were also called that because they were horrible things. They were very dangerous for two main reasons. Sometimes they wouldn't go bang when you wanted them to go bang, and sometimes they would go bang when you didn't want them to go bang. Now, normally you pull a pin from the grenade, you throw it, and it starts a fuse which takes it a number of seconds to burn, and maybe 5.5 seconds later, in other words, it's a timer, bang, the grenade goes off. And that's how British and German grenades worked. But the Italians thought, no, much better to have one that just hits the ground and immediately explodes, no delay. That'll do much more damage to the enemy, yeah? But there were problems. So there was an all-ways fuse. So no matter what direction the grenade hit the ground, it was supposed to cause it to explode. The trouble is that it didn't always work because it just wasn't brilliantly reliable. But sometimes it landed on soft, springy turf or in some sand or something, and so that the gentleness of the landing meant that it didn't go off. So if it doesn't go off, it doesn't do any harm to the enemy, but then it's lying around unexploded on the ground. And no matter who, you or the enemy, walks over it and perhaps treads on it, then gets a foot blown off. So they were called Red Devils because you had to watch out after a battle, because these things would be littering the ground, these unexploded bombs that have now become mines, Red Devils. And this was an occasion when it went bang when they didn't want to, because she was dancing away and she did a particularly fast swirl and it flew off her belt and bang. Nasty. So there you go. Don't wear Red Devils on your belt. Now, the partisans thought that it would be a very good idea to defend islands. There are a lot of islands off the coast of Yugoslavia, and it seems quite an obvious place for partisans to hide out. You can hide out in the mountains or the forests, or how about on these loads of islands? We can get out with little boats and make friends with the fishermen, get in, get out, and have little hideaways, caves. It'd be brilliant. But the British had a very different opinion. The British thought, no, that's a very bad idea, because partisans can't really defend an island. The Germans, with their resources, their naval and air resources and superior numbers, they could surround an island, cut it off, and just take everybody on it prisoner, or just kill them all. You can't really hold an island against the might of the Axis powers. However, let's reverse it. Let's let the Germans take all these islands and then feel that they have to defend them all, which will require an awful lot of manpower and resources, which will then be completely useless because we then just choose not to attack the islands. Let's make the Germans waste their resources defending the islands. Let's not try to defend them ourselves. And strategically, I think that was probably a sound move. But there was an exception. That was the island of Vis. Now, Vis, as this map shows, is very central. It's big. It's further away from the Yugoslav coast than most, and it is a place that has long been recognised as of strategic importance. There were crumbling old Venetian forts on it, and indeed the remains of an old British army base from way back when. And the British looked at Vis and thought, you know what, this would make a really good base. How about we put there's a perfect place in the centre of the island, a valley for an airstrip. So we could have a protected airstrip in the centre of the island. We've got these caves, we could have motor torpedo boats there, a little naval base. But we'd have to defend this quite stoutly. We'd need maybe it would take about 2 brigades to really defend this place properly. So how do we get those then? Well, thank goodness for New Year's Eve parties, because Maclean got himself invited to a New Year's Eve party in Italy, and he was there and he ran into his old mate Randolph Churchill from his SAS days in North Africa. Randolph Churchill, of course, being the son of Churchill, so he'd have the Prime Minister's ear, and Churchill introduced him to his mate Churchill. This was Jonathan Churchill and his brother Tom. And Jonathan was in command of No. 2 Commando. And you might have heard of this because he was more commonly called Jack Churchill. Incidentally, he was not related to Winston Churchill, but when the enemy eventually captured him, they thought, woohoo, we've got a Churchill. They were wrong. But anyway, he was also known as Mad Jack Churchill. Why Mad Jack Churchill? Well, lots of reasons, but I think that it's unlikely to be completely unconnected with his unusual choice of weaponry when going into battle. And he went into battle an awful lot of times in an awful lot of places. Rather than the usual submachine gun or rifle, no, he would go into battle with a sword, because obviously no British officer goes improperly dressed into a battle, so he's got to have a sword, and then he would have, bagpipes, obviously. Even though he was quite a senior officer, he would go into battle playing the bagpipes, but he would also have grenades, so he'd throw grenades, which is unusual for a bagpiper. But you think that he must have had some longer range weapon than that, although I suppose you could say that the bagpipes is a form of range weapon, but no, he carried into battle a longbow. I say carried into battle, no, he definitely did. There are many people attesting to this. He used it, and to lethal effect. He shot actual Germans actually dead in World War II with a longbow, and some people thought that that was mad. Anyway, he was very keen on getting at the Boche, and he was at this New Year's Eve party, and Maclean said, do you know what, I've got this idea. How would you like to use your No. 2 Commando to garrison an island, and from there you could, with various naval resources and aircrafts, you could go raiding all up and down the Dalmatian coast. What do you reckon? Does that sound fun? And Jack and Tom thought, oh, that sounds like a brilliant wheeze. We're in. Obviously, it took a little bit more clearing things with people higher up, but when your friend is the son of the Prime Minister, your wheels turn reasonably quickly. So he got No. 2 Commando to garrison Vis. And this would later become the base from which Tito was running the war for quite some while. And this is something I did not understand until I read Eastern Approaches. The massive degree to which the British were committed militarily in Yugoslavia. I thought it was just a political sideshow, a few liaison officers, a few supply drops and so forth. But no, there were significant Royal Navy, Royal Air Force and commando forces being committed and fighting on the Yugoslav side. So Vis then became a base. Now, there was a conference in Morocco, and Maclean went to this, and this was the conference at which the Anzio landings were going to be put together and agreed on. And this, of course, is a top secret operation, so he deliberately, even though he could have attended the meetings and learned more, he thought, the less I know, the better about this sort of thing, so he deliberately avoided those meetings. But he did get to meet Churchill and discuss at length his plans for Yugoslavia, for throwing the British might behind Tito, setting up Vis as a base, and cut a long story short, he pretty much got the go-ahead. And when he returned to Yugoslavia, he had a letter which he could then put into Tito's hand, and this is quite a significant moment. You might think it's just two men, one gives the other a piece of paper, but this piece of paper was a letter specifically to Tito, delivered into Tito's hands by Churchill's representative, written personally by Churchill, saying, "We will support you." This was very significant because this was Tito's first international recognition. He wasn't now just a little partisan leader with a band of desperados in Yugoslavia. He was now a player on the world stage thanks to this one piece of paper. And this piece of paper said that the British would help him in lots of ways, including very significantly giving him substantial air cover, and they committed as well to training up any Yugoslavians that they could get out who could be trained up as pilots. They were sent to North Africa and trained in Hurricanes, and if an RAF plane was flown by one of these Yugoslav volunteers, then it had slightly different markings. You see, it was given a red star, a little communist red star on top of the RAF Rondel. So there you go, a little bit of trivia could help you in a pub quiz one day. What British planes flew with a communist star in World War II? Well, there you go. Now you know the answer. And I've seen there are a number of planes. There wasn't all Hurricanes. There were Spitfires and I think Beaufighters and others. Anyway, so the Moroccan conference was over. He'd returned from that, and this meant that Churchill had to say to King Peter, you know all those speeches you've been broadcasting saying, could the people of Yugoslavia please back the Chetniks? Could you sort of change a tune rather a lot and not really mention the Chetniks much at all, and instead say they should be following Tito and his partisans? Would that be all right? And you could imagine that this was something that the king was not tremendously keen on doing, but he was persuaded that this was the way forward. Okay, if this is how we're going to win the war and how I continue being your friend and having British support, okay, right, yes, I will do that. And so he did. But of course, if you've backed one side and then you back the other, you end up not being entirely trusted by either side. So in the long term, it rather weakened his position.
Actually, it was more complicated than that.
Anyway, there was another conference, and this... hang on. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. Right. Tito was now in a very strong position. He had the backing of the British, and he was now being supplied by substantial amounts of stuff. He had on call now an air force. It was a Royal Air Force. There were squadrons of planes based in Italy, but these were flying over and giving him air support in Yugoslavia. Later on, there was the BAF, the Balkan Air Force, formed, and this was a force that was at his disposal. It was the Balkan Air Force under a single British commander became Tito's Air Force as commanded from his base on Vis. So he was now in a very strong position, and he was able to issue ultimata. He was able to say, right, now you join me or you become an enemy. And if you are in the Chetniks and you want to carry on the fight, you join the partisans. I demand this as a condition of support. No, you have to give up your uniforms, wear different stuff. You have to wear the partisans. When Maclean first got there, had no uniforms at all, except that they all had a little red star with a hammer and sickle on it. That was their uniform, which rather gave the game away as to which way their political leanings went. And you have to join up and become a partisan, wear the badge, and go under my command. So he was in a strong enough position to ask for that. At this point, Maclean and others found themselves looking up at a German plane that was behaving very unusually in the sky. And Maclean, at least in his account, was the one who said, I think it's acting as a reconnaissance plane. I don't think it's doing anything combative. I think it's a reconnaissance plane. And he was very quickly proven right, because a lot of other German planes soon turned up, and an awful lot of parachutes opened in the sky and gliders swooped in, and yep, somehow, Maclean doesn't record it in his book, presumably he just didn't know, but somehow the Germans had found out exactly where Tito was and attacked his base up in the hills from the air. And Tito had to go on the run, and just a few hundred men, he went on the run for quite some while, and with Maclean's help, Maclean was able to spirit him to Vis. Oh, this reminds me of another anecdote. A Dakota load of American nurses crashed in Yugoslavia, and a British officer was able to get to them and to march them. It took several days to march them to safety and get them away. This was not made easier by the fact that the nurses were all in high heels. That was a fashion decision I'm pretty sure they live to regret. And that's probably that's probably a decision, a mistake that you don't make twice. Anyway, sorry, bit of a digression. So he gets to Vis with his dog Tigger, who went everywhere with him, and his secretary come personal servant come, it's difficult to say what, Olga. Now, I've only found one photograph of Tito and Olga, and she does seem to be quite a good-looking young woman. Unfortunately, I can't show you the photograph because it's copyrighted, but Tito and Olga, just and you'll find it on the interweb very easily. In Eastern Approaches, Maclean leaves it for the reader to perhaps add a third thing that Olga might have been to Tito. Anyway, they go to the base, and pretty soon they are whisked away to Italy again for another conference, and they were going to meet there the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean Theatre, General Jumbo Wilson, and a high-ranking officer greeted Tito and formally ushered him towards the limousine of the general, which was being driven by a glamorous blonde. Always good to put on a show. And then he was whisked away to the captain's hunting lodge. Captain, the general, the Supreme Allied Commander, even, as hunting lodge. And as you can imagine, hunting lodges are not terribly big. It was a bit of a cramped affair. There were only about half a dozen people, shoulder to shoulder, around the table in this small hunting lodge. And there wasn't really a huge amount of room for the Italian waiters to get by and serve. But even so, Tito's two hefty bodyguards squeezed their way past and stood there looking like the desperado that perhaps they were, with submachine guns in their hands, one of them covering the Supreme Allied Commander and the other one trying to cover everyone, and they were looking very sternly at everyone. And there was a bit of an awkward moment, really, because no one knew quite how to open the conversation at that point. Lovely weather we're having. It didn't seem to be quite so appropriate, and there was this awkward silence. But it was an Italian waiter who came to the rescue, because there he was. Oh, I should say, by the way, that these two bodyguards absolutely hated Italians and made no secret of this whatsoever. And so there he was, trying to serve vegetables from a dish with a guy pointing a submachine gun at him and looking as though he was just about to pull the trigger at any moment. And this got the better of the poor Italian waiter, who, with a crash, just let the dish of vegetables fall to the table, and in a panic ran from the room. And there was pandemonium. Tigger, the dog, which was under the table, leapt to its feet and started howling. And the bodyguards were then trying to work. Is this a cover for something? Was that a cover, that loud noise, making to cover the fact that there was going to be an explosion? Was there a bomb in the vegetables? What's going on? And they had itchy trigger fingers, and Jumbo Wilson, silently at first, but then gradually increasing in volume, started laughing. And according to Maclean, he had a particularly wonderful laugh, and that it was a very infectious laugh, and pretty soon the entire table were laughing about it, and things got a lot more cordial and productive after that. So a tense moment, but thanks to that Italian waiter, it all worked out fine in the end. Now, Tito was demanding a lot of things. He wanted Trieste, for example. As Maclean had predicted, he knew what the Russians were like from his days in Moscow. He knew that the Soviet Empire was extremely expansionist and ambitious for new territory, and he wasn't at all surprised to find out that, that Tito had expansionist demands, and he wanted Trieste and various other places. The Trieste was a particular jewel that he was after, and the Allies obviously weren't very keen on making that sort of promise to him. But they wanted to keep him on side, and they wanted to explain a lot of things to him. One, for instance, is why they weren't giving him any tanks. Now, he'd been asking for tanks over and over. He had no tanks. What? The Germans have tanks. When they turn up with tanks, my men have just got rifles. What are we supposed to do? We need tanks. A proper commander has tanks. We've got naval ships. We've got an air force now. I've got all these men, and you've been giving me my men instructions in the use of artillery now, and you've been delivering loads of 75mm pack howitzers, which are things which break down into few pieces. You can stick them on a mule and transport them. Very handy for fighting in hilly country, and the Allies delivered loads of those, and they were quite effective. But no tanks. Why don't you give me tanks? Well, they kept saying, you don't really want tanks. Tanks are a bad idea for you. But no, he didn't feel, I want some tanks, damn it. And you could understand. I mean, you'd want tanks, wouldn't you, in his position? So they took the opportunity to take him to the 8th Army Tank Maintenance Depot with its staff of 12,000. Yeah, it took 12,000 mechanics to keep the 8th Army's tanks running. And it seems that then they were finally able to persuade Tito, maybe I don't want tanks. He did get some armoured cars, though. I know this because I read of one action in which the Germans were fighting the partisans, and they looked as though they were on a bit of a sticky wicket, but to their relief they saw some armoured vehicles showing up. Hooray, thought the Germans, reinforcements, because if they saw an armoured vehicle it was always theirs. And they were very welcoming until they realised a little bit too late that, oh no, these, oh, hang on, they've got armour cars. Who's changed the rules? Anyway, but no tanks. The idea of trying to maintain tanks with partisans in the hills wasn't going to work. So, no. Aircraft, yeah, they can fly home again at the end of the day, but tanks can't do that. And they kept showing him more and more stuff. They wanted to keep him in the country. They took him to Casino so that he could see lots of bullet holes. They took him to Rome. And look, a marble thing. The reason they were doing this is they wanted Churchill to meet him face to face for the first time. Churchill had never met him and they thought this was an important meeting, and presumably Churchill also said, keep him there, I want to see him, I will be there presently. And this did actually happen. They were able to distract him and keep him in Italy for long enough for Churchill to come over and meet him face to face. And Churchill got on very well with Tito, which doesn't surprise me at all, because Churchill was quite good at that sort of thing. He was very good at throwing together coalition cabinets right from the start of the war and keeping things running. He knew that he had to get on with all his allies and potential allies. It was vital for the war effort and vital for his premiership. So I'm not surprised that he got on. I'm sure he was making quite an effort to get on. Anyway, he was able to get on very well with Tito. And he promised him yet more support, which Tito did indeed get. He said to him at one point, my friend Marshal Stalin said that the battle he had to enforce the collectivization of agricultural land with the peasantry was harder even than the Battle of Stalingrad. I'm sure he was dropping quite a hint there, but it fell, I imagine, on fairly deaf ears. Anyway, that is Churchill, persuaded Tito that he would have to make some accommodations. He would have to make accommodations with the Chetniks, with the Croatians, and with the royal family, which had been loyal. The King Peter II had thrown his lot in with the British when things were dark and things were looking really bad, and it definitely looked as though the side to be on was the Axis side. He had thrown in his lot with the British, and so the British owed him. And so Churchill insisted that a constitutional monarchy government be set up, and this royal government have members in it from all the various factions of Yugoslavia, not just your communists, Tito. Sorry, I shouldn't have pointed like that. I'm sure he was diplomatic enough not to do that when referring to your communists. And Tito did agree to this. And now, something else that happened at this point is that Maclean wanted to get a load get the okay for a lot of important supplies and cooperation from Churchill himself, because it always helps to have word from the top. But he couldn't find him. Where was Churchill? Where was Churchill? He went to the people who were supposedly looking after Churchill. Where's Churchill? We don't know where Churchill is, and we're supposed to be keeping him safe. What if he gets assassinated and then we'll all get the blame and it'll be horrible? Where was Churchill? Well, Maclean did eventually find Churchill on the deck of a bright blue speeding boat that was nipping in and out of the invasion fleet that was invading France. Because Churchill didn't want to miss the invasion of France. Well, you wouldn't, would you? So there he was, speeding around the fleet that was actually sailing into action at the time, in a boiler suit, Panama hat, big cigar, and flicking V signs, V for victory. Nah, not, I say flicking. Perhaps flicking made it sound rude. Because when I was a little boy, that sign that I've just made, I won't do it again, was considered extremely rude, but these days not so much. It's lost its power. But anyway, doing V for victory signs to the invading fleet. Anyway, he found him, had a word, and oh yes, he got what he wanted. So, what did he want? He wanted resources and cooperation for Rat Week. Rat Week was, according to Maclean, his own idea. He saw that pretty soon the Germans were likely to spot that it was over, that the Allies were making their way up Italy, they were invading France now, the soft underbelly of Europe and all that, and Greece didn't look too tenable either, and so at some point the rats would leave the sinking ship, and the Germans in Greece and Yugoslavia would try to get out and make it back to the fatherland, and if they made it back to the fatherland, they would then be able to defend that fatherland so much more effectively than the Germans could without them, and the war would go on a lot longer and a lot more people would be killed. So if he could cut off the Germans in Greece and Yugoslavia, that would be great. If you could then destroy all the railways and big bridges and that sort of thing, and pound, really hit those concentrations of troops, because at the moment the Germans were scattered in fortified places all over Yugoslavia. But of course they would have to move, so they'd have to get onto the roads, and they would have to concentrate, and there would be bottlenecks like bridges and railway lines, so they would be vulnerable. If he could time it right, and he was guessing, because at the moment the Germans were not withdrawing, but if he could get it right, he could hit them and hit them hard and deprive the fatherland of many divisions of Germans. So he went to Tito with his plan, and Tito was eventually persuaded to help. That's significant, isn't it? Why would you have to persuade Tito to help? If Tito was really all about fighting the Boche, throwing off the yoke of the enemy, he would be saying, yes, what, really? You're going to get them on the run and hammer them hard? I'm in, you would think. But Tito needed persuading and didn't really seem to throw his forces into the operation wholeheartedly, just a token amount so that he could be seen to have done something, it seems, is his level of cooperation. He would much rather not waste his forces, perhaps, against the Germans leaving, just let them leave. And if he needed to fight anyone, he'd be fighting perhaps the Chetniks. Now, the Chetniks often get painted as the baddies. You've got the heroic socialists, communist, partisans fighting for victory, and the Chetniks some of them collaborated with the Germans, didn't they? And some of them were Croats, and some of the Croats sided with the Germans, and there are so many factions. I mean, the level of complexity of this is just mind-boggling. Do you know, for instance, that there was an SS division made up of Bosnian Muslims? Yeah, Muslim, and I say that again, yeah, here they are, look, wearing fezzes. And here they are, praying towards Mecca. Those are SS troopers praying towards Mecca. You couldn't make this up. Yeah, but that's how complicated it was. So all these different factions with their different loyalties. And how did I get on with that? So, yes, so it could be that Mihailovic didn't blow up that bridge because of the reprisals that I talked about earlier. And he was thinking, well, yeah, I could blow up the bridge, but there'll be a couple of German sentries guarding that bridge. We kill the German sentries. They will then kill a couple of hundred of my people, and then the Germans will rebuild the bridge. So what have I gained? And they might do it using slave labour enforced from the local people. So what have I gained by doing that? So maybe that's why he didn't specifically blow up that bridge. But also, maybe the Chetniks would fight against the partisans because they stood no chance of beating the Germans. They stood no chance of, on their own, actually taking the whole of Yugoslavia off the Germans and holding it. That was impossible. All they could do were little guerrilla actions. So maybe what they really should do is just annoy the Germans with their presence until the Allies show up in force. And then when the Allies are invading Yugoslavia, then they can all spring out of the woodwork and blow up railway lines and do all sorts of things useful for the Allied invasion of Yugoslavia. And so maybe that's a more useful thing that they can do for the war effort. Plus, they don't want, there's something worth fighting for. They don't want Yugoslavia to go communist. So if they fight anyone, it'll be fight the partisans so that when the liberation does happen, the partisans are not in a position to take over and impose communism on Yugoslavia. So that's actually quite a rational stance for the Chetniks to take. And if you accept that argument, then surely it applies also to Tito and the partisans. Maybe what Tito was actually doing was just waiting for the Allies to liberate so that he could then take over and make Yugoslavia communist. It's exactly the same thing, but just viewed from the other side of the divide. So could you say it's any better or any worse? Now, that he had to be persuaded to help was a bit of an alarm bell. But Maclean had his work cut out for him, so he went off to Serbia to try to coordinate Rat Week, and he was a little bit nervous about this because he hadn't spent much time in Serbia. He didn't know quite what reaction he was going to get from the locals there, but it turned out to be not too bad. He didn't go with Tito, but he took Tito's right-hand man with him. And he was able to coordinate things with RAF support and the US Air Force as well. And one of the things he organised was the flattening of the town of Leskovac. Now, Leskovac today, still every year, holds a memorial for the day when 50 American flying fortresses turned up and flattened the place. Now, 50 fortresses was a greater bomber load than any of the locals had ever seen. Yes, okay, there were 800 or so bomber raids on places like Hamburg elsewhere in the war, but in Yugoslavia, no one had seen that sort of aerial might, and it was quite awe-inspiring. These sort of, 10, 20, 30, 40 enormous bombers. Look at the size of them. And they would open their bomb doors, and he was there. He was watching the bombs drop, and they caused devastation to this town, which had a high concentration of German troops in it and German vehicles, including lots of armoured vehicles. So militarily, it was, you could say, a legitimate target. But it was a town, and there were lots of civilians that got killed in that town. And he describes the wailing of the women who realised that their relatives and friends were in that town. So militarily, it was justified, you could say. It was destroying a transport node. But was it in the long term actually a really great move? You see, the Russians, when they eventually turned up, which they didn't until October '44, they didn't do any bombing. And possibly they were doing this quite deliberately, or not doing this quite deliberately, as a part of winning over the hearts and minds. You see, it was something that Tito could use later. Oh, these Western allies, they're not really on our side. Remember, for instance, when Leskovac got flattened by the US Air Force and all those civilians got killed? Oh yes, they're not our friends. The Russians are our friends. So it was perhaps a propaganda victory for the Reds. And possibly, I don't know, possibly Maclean regretted that. He certainly lists no regrets in his book. He tells these interesting anecdotes. He tells about what he does, but sometimes he leaves out any sort of emotional context, which I find very odd. For instance, when Belgrade got liberated, he just mentions in one sentence that there was a very large concentration camp just outside Belgrade that was liberated. And that's it. It doesn't say anything more. It doesn't say what the consequences of that were, what people thought of it, what emotional effect it had on him. Anything. He just states it as a fact and then moves on. I find that a significant omission. Anyway, Rat Week did have useful knock-on effects because there were an awful lot of allies with the Germans. There were Bulgarians, there were White Russians, there were the Bosnian Muslims I talked of, and these groups, and lots of Croats. And these groups deserted in droves. Oh, at this point, Russia then declares war on Bulgaria, which was a bit belated. You think, what? You've left it this late to declare war on Bulgaria? Why did you leave it so late? Well, you don't want all the responsibility of having to be at war with someone, but when it's obvious that they're just about to lose, if you declare war on them, you're then on the winning side, and so you get a seat at the negotiation table in the peace conference afterwards. So it's worth declaring war, albeit at the last minute. At which point the Bulgarians had to think, oh, what, you're declaring war? All right, okay. So then they started fighting the Germans, using the equipment that the Germans had lent them, in order to show that, oh, now we're on this side. So now we're killing Germans. And look, some of us are being killed in the struggle against the Axis powers. Look, see, we're doing our bit. So that meant that they could get a seat. So there you go. So all those people had to die just so that someone could sit in a different chair at the peace conference. I know, the world may seem mad, but that's how it worked. Anyway, they successfully blew up the main railway that led to Greece, which cutting off an awful lot of German forces and slowing up their retreat, and far more Germans were taken prisoner as a result. And so this was shortening the war. So militarily, this Rat Week, it seemed, was a worthwhile exercise. Now, the Serbs were very there's King Peter, and they were sort of in favour of him, that they were very pro-monarchist, but they didn't particularly like Peter, as I say, because he had jumped ship and thrown in his lot with Tito, and he'd been in Britain all this time instead of fighting the war in Yugoslavia. So, yeah, he was in a weak position, Peter, even with what you might call his natural power base within Yugoslavia. Something I should mention here, there was a typhus outbreak that happened during this operation. So in the fight for Belgrade and Rat Week, that part of the war, when the Russians are first turning up as well, they're appearing on the horizon up in the northeast, there was a typhus outbreak, and an awful lot of people were looking around themselves thinking, okay, there are an awful lot of factions here with an awful lot of scores to settle, and they may not completely understand whose side we were on really all along. So what we could do is we could put a black flag outside our house to show that there's typhoid here, don't come in, even if there's no actual typhoid. But of course, people were discovered using this ploy as a ruse, and they didn't have typhoid, and so that was yet another aspect to the nastiness, the typhoid and the way it was used, and the reason it was used. So you can imagine this was not a nice time to be living in that area. Maclean talks about a massive German column that hurled across a bridge in Belgrade and got to the other side successfully, and then after quite a gap, nothing much happened. Then a lot of Russians charged after them as well, which he thought was a little bit strange. Why didn't the Germans blow up the bridge? Well, they did try to blow up the bridge. They had mines rigged for that purpose, but a schoolmaster who lived next to the bridge just went out there and disconnected the mines, and that's why the bridge didn't blow up, and they gave him a medal for that, and he wasn't the first one he'd won as well. Many years before, he'd got one for doing something else that I've forgotten. Yes, so the Bulgars, no, I've done that. At this moment, in amongst all this complexity, Tito disappears, and the British cannot make contact with him. Walking alongside his horse. Oh, sorry, another anecdote. Maclean was with another British officer walking alongside his horse, because though they could ride quite often, and British officers often did ride horses, and it made sense in hilly terrain, they would often get off, walk along, and let someone else use the horse for a bit. Interestingly, the communists did not like this. They were officers, and the communists were very, very hierarchical, and they didn't like it when people broke the hierarchy, which is, there you go. The complexities within complexities. You can't make this stuff up. Anyway, so there he was, a long way away. They contacted him saying, "Where's Tito?" "I don't know. I'm in Serbia. Tito's elsewhere." He's gone missing now, you say. Yes, and you're the person on the ground. You're the guy who speaks the local language better than anyone else. You know him better than anyone else. You'll know where he's gone. You've got lots of friends who perhaps know where he's gone. You can ask them. You've got the inside track there, if you like. We think you're the guy for this job. Find Tito. This is your mission. So he then tried to find Tito, and long story short, Tito had been flown off Vis for a conference with the Russians. Yeah, right at that moment, when British pilots are dying, when British forces are committed to Rat Week, when the British are supplying him all his, actually it was largely American food, apparently it was horrible, but it was, even so, they were eating American food, wearing British uniforms, firing British bullets. In fact, I've got some figures here. Right, I have on here this piece of paper in our time. It shows that in 1944, this is just 1 year, 1944, admittedly it's the year they supplied the most, the Western Allies supplied the partisans, that's just the partisans, just Tito's lot, amongst other things, 700 wireless sets, that's radios, 175,000 suits of battle dress uniform, 260,000 pairs of boots, well over 100,000 rifles, 50,000 light machine guns and submachine guns, 1,380 mortars, 324,000 mortar bombs, 636,000 grenades, and 97.5 million bullets. And yes, I know, it's all right, you can put the calculator down. I'll save you. That's 3 bullets per second for the whole year. So they could fire at that rate for the entire year and not run out of ammunition. So we've supplied you all this. We've been garrisoning an army, garrisoning an island, keeping you safe, giving you a base. We've given you an air force that you've had on call. You've got these boats raiding up and down the coast, commandos raiding the... Oh, I've got to talk to you about some of the commandos. And this is the ingratitude you show. You then fly off to deal at this 11th hour with some other force that's not hitherto been fighting here. This you do now. Can you not see how this timing looks really bad? It was a big dent to Anglo-Yugoslav relations, or at least Anglo-Tito relations, that at that moment, yes, he decided to go off and talk to the Russians. And according to Tito, he gave Stalin permission to send Russian troops into Yugoslavia. Yeah, he gave Stalin permission to do that. I'm sure it was that way around, Tito. Anyway, oh, yeah, I just said I was going to mention one of the commandos. There's just an amazing... It's really got nothing to do with anything, but I just love this story. There was an admiral, a British admiral, who wanted to act as a commando for a bit. And so he went along to Mad Jack and number 2 commander and said, "Can I be a commando?" And if you're an admiral, you can pull strings, so he got to be a commando. So this was Admiral Sir Walter Cowan. So it's remarkable that he'd gone up through the ranks to reach Admiral, top naval ranks. That's pretty remarkable. Well, Sir, he was a Sir and been made a baronet as well. And it wasn't just any knighthood. I think it was Order of the Bath or something because of his sterling work in World War I, fighting the Bolshevik Navy and contributing significantly to the independence of Estonia, for which the Estonians gave him a big gong. Of course, they got... absorbed into the Soviet Empire after World War II, but it was okay. They let him keep the medal. They don't take it away retrospectively. They thanked him for at least trying and succeeding for a while to keep Estonia free of Soviet influence. So he'd done that, and now he wanted to be a commander because throughout his entire career he'd loved getting up close and personal. I mean, it's all right being in a ship, what have you, but half the time you're firing at targets on the horizon. Where's the fun in that? He'd like to get in there with grenades and bayonets, get on land, get up to the enemy and fight. And so he wanted to be a commando. And so, all right, so there you go. He could pull strings. So he's remarkable because of he's an admiral and he's an amazing knight, and he then becomes a commando, and then he does lots of raids, and he wins the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, this medal, which is only 1 notch down from the Victoria Cross. So all that is pretty remarkable. I think you'll agree already. But I haven't mentioned that he was 73 years old. I think he must be surely the oldest guy ever to win the DSO. Pretty difficult to beat that record. And he was also one of the oldest combatants in the British forces in World War II. So he was 73. And, more remarkable again, it wasn't the first time he'd won the DSO. Oh no. No, he'd already won the DSO fighting against the French in Sudan in the 1890s. Anyway, yes, really not all that relevant, but I'd like to get that one in. He's a historical figure, doesn't get much of a mention, so whereas loads of people have heard of Mad Jack. So, yes, so Tito comes back. Oh, did you miss me? Oh, I've just been talking to the Russians. So that was not a great moment in Anglo-Tito relations. Now, the battle for Belgrade went ahead, the Russians approaching from the northeast, and our man Maclean went into Belgrade and was given a jeep tour of Belgrade, made all the more exciting by the fact that the city was being shelled quite heavily at the time. But it's always good to take advantage of a local guide, you know, miss the crowds. And Belgrade fell, and the nature of the war changed, because up until this point the partisans had been acting as guerrilla fighters in the hills and valleys and so forth, whereas now there was a front line which was rather alien to the partisans' way of thinking and fighting. And Tito took up residence in a magnificent English-style Georgian palace, complete even with gold plate that somehow the retreating armies hadn't nicked. And he wore the finest tailoring, smoked the finest cigars, ate the finest food, rode the finest horses. Oh yeah, he really took to palace life very, very quickly and enthusiastically. And he was now ruling from a city. He was now looking far more like a proper ruler, if you like, a legitimate ruler in the sense that when people think of the ruler of a country, oh yeah, a guy in a palace with nice tailoring. Yeah, so he very rapidly became that. And war is very good for communism, because if there's a war on, then whoever's running things can justify conscription, recruitment, and can justify state control of the media, can justify requisitioning stuff, whatever you want you can get, and can justify, quite logically, centralised rule. And Britain's rule was very centralised, and Britain didn't go communist, but Britain had all of those things, requisitioning, compulsory land purchases, and the like. But you can see how if you're a communist, all those things feed into communism very readily. So the communists were doing very well out of the war situation, and of course the approaching Soviets. And the Soviets arrived, the various local quislings were captured and given surprisingly lenient sentences. And it's interesting reading Maclean's description of the first Soviet troops that he encountered, their high cheekbones, their tanned faces, how racially very varied they were, how they were very, very slovenly, their ill-fitting uniforms, oil-stained and ripped. Half of them had worn-out boots, but he did mention that their rifles were kept in good condition, well-oiled. And he also described all sorts of Russian smells that were instantly familiar to him from his time adventuring around the Soviet Union just before the war started. The smells of unwashed people, of sheepskin clothes, of vodka and black bread and cabbage soup and petrol. And he also pointed out how, oh yeah, and they all wore full-size medals all the time. And he also said, he noticed something very odd about the lorries, and he got other people to look at the lorries as well, and everyone reported the same, which was that all the lorries that were with the Soviet advancing army, they were all full of petrol and ammunition, and that was about it. No food, no blankets, none of that stuff. Where were they getting that stuff from? It seemed that they were just getting that from the locals by whatever means they could as they went along, which was a rather different way of operating from the British way of doing things, at least in that period. So that was his description of the first Russians that he came across. One of them was describing his lorry. This is a beautiful lorry. I can't do a Russian accent. No capitalist could produce such a fine lorry. And he was looking at it thinking, that lorry was made in Detroit. But anyway, they were convinced that these American lorries were in fact good Soviet lorries. So Belgrade has fallen. This was the first time he'd seen tarmac roads in Yugoslavia in the entire war. I find that an interesting thing to remark on. Tarmac! And a march past was organised of troops that had just come from battle and were just about to battle again, but have a big march past, show your might, putting on a show again. And there he held the constitutional monarchy elections that he had promised the British. And there was a very lavish swearing-in ceremony of 3 regents. The churches all vied with each other for the magnificence of the occasions that they put on, and these ceremonies happened. Everyone cheered, flags were waved, all that usual stuff. But these guys were just puppets, really. Their rule was not going to last any length of time. They weren't going to be allowed to have any real power. And Tito admitted to Maclean quite openly that he was only holding these elections just to make sure that he got recognition from the Western Allies. That was it. Okay, he is a legitimate ruler because he had elections. Okay, now let him go on with stuff. One really nasty incident was that one night all the jeeps of the Americans were stolen, and the British Maclean reports just thought this was a bit funny. Oh, these trusting, naive Americans. Oh dear. But just to be on the safe side, we'll post a sentry to guard our jeeps. And then the next day they found that the sentry had shot someone. And oh, God, that was a bit more drastic than we were expecting, really. You had to shoot someone. And the next night, all their jeeps were gone and the sentry was dead. And of course, that really harmed Russian-British relations. The Russians were doing things like this, and of course, blaming it on disparate rebels of some sort, not us. But But isn't that horrible? A couple of people had to die because of some people wanting to steal some jeeps. That's just, and the war's nearly over. I find that particularly horrible for some reason. That anecdote really makes me feel horrible. Anyway, so the war in Yugoslavia was coming to an end, and Tito made it super clear, because as soon as he was established as the ruler, first day, his honour guard shows up wearing Soviet uniforms. Not the ones the British had given him, no. Soviet uniforms. He was completely open about it. That's the way I'm going. Thanks to the West, thanks West, but goodbye to you. I'm embracing things to the East. I could leave it there, but I'm going to say a little bit more about how it's possible that, as I've mentioned already, that Maclean was to some degree duped. It could be that Tito, in fact, had never any intention of doing anything other than trying to conquer or to seize the country for himself. He ruled until 1980. He ruled Yugoslavia, and he stopped ruling Yugoslavia because he died. And then 10 years later, as you probably know, the country then collapsed into a horrible civil war. And there are people who point out that there was apparently a meeting between Tito's men and the Axis forces, and that they came to a collaborative agreement. It never actually got enacted because the situation changed, but an agreement had at one point been made. There are reports by British agents of partisans attacking Chetniks whilst the Chetniks were fighting the Germans. I don't know of anyone who's ever been able to pin any collaboration on Mihailovic himself. It could be that, yes, other people associated with the Chetniks collaborated with the Nazis, but no reason to believe that he did. There were a lot of people who wanted to smear his reputation and big up Tito. So it could be that Tito had actually pulled a fast one, had to some degree duped Maclean, and it did turn out that there was a communist mole in British-controlled Cairo, and the agents in Yugoslavia were sending their reports through Cairo to London, and this communist mole was filtering out any report that put Tito in a bad light. Somehow mysteriously didn't make it to London. But the guys making their reports to Cairo, they didn't know that it wasn't all getting through. So they were pretty angry about that. So it seems that there was a communist mole in Cairo, that maybe to some degree Tito had pulled the wool over Maclean's eyes, but also that Tito had just played a very good game of bluff and brinkmanship with Churchill, and he was able to secure a substantial amount of British support, which ultimately set him up as a communist dictator. Right, I think I've probably said enough, don't you?
Quindi